Well, welcome to the Cybersecurity Collaborative. We have many people on the call today. We want to give people an extra chance to dial in. So this is a very exciting topic, cyber risk insurance, the challenges, the value, and the reality. Today, it's a pleasure to be here with Bryan Hurd and VJ Viswanathan. And before we introduce those speakers, I'd like to introduce the Cybersecurity Collaborative. I am your host today. I'm Todd Fitzgerald. I'm the VP of Cybersecurity Strategy for the Collaborative and also the author of the CISO Compass book. I'm very pleased to be representing the Collaborative today in this excellent presentation about a very timely topic. The Cybersecurity Collaborative is a membership community that provides the opportunity for cyber leaders to work together in a peer setting to share those strategic, technical, tactical insights and also help with career development. We have many different offerings from task forces to the morning security reports, all to help our cybersecurity leaders be more effective. We have a very great opportunity currently with our parent company. The Cyber Risk Alliance has put forth a $1 million cyber resiliency fund. And this fund is to help organizations during the pandemic that have lost budget, have lost headcount, making it more difficult for organizations. This fund is providing a 50% discount to a full year membership with the Collaborative to be part of this community. And this is good through the end of the year. Many organizations have taken part in this, so these grants are available through our website, cyberleadersunite.com. Please contact us for more information. Without further ado here, I want to talk about this topic today. Cybersecurity has evolved a lot over the last few decades. We have, moved into this world where several years ago, organizations didn't really have cyber insurance. In a few years, everybody will have cyber insurance. And we have two excellent experts today that will be able to talk about cybersecurity insurance and how that relates to our organizations and give the real skinny, as I like to say, around cybersecurity insurance. Our first speaker today, Bryan Hurd. Bryan Hurd is a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy and formed the U.S. Navy's first ever cyber counterintelligence program called National Criminal Investigative Service, NCIS.
Naval Criminal Investigative Service.
I've been corrected.
Go Navy.
So I'll make sure I get that right. He was also the first chief of intelligence for Microsoft's digital crimes unit. He founded the cyber forensics program at EDS, which is now HP. He's a global recognized expert in this area and has led many investigations dealing with cybersecurity breaches. He currently leads Aon Cyber Solutions, Seattle office and for Computer Forensics Laboratory. We're pleased to have him with us today. We also have VJ Viswanathan. He's a very seasoned technology executive. He's the founding partner at Cyforix, global security research advisory and strategic consulting firm. He's also the co-host of Elevate Intel, a podcast series which talks about the nexus of technology, social, and defense. He has over 25 years of cybersecurity insurance, and he has developed some products around supply chain management and risk management. And we're very pleased to have both of these speakers here with us today. So I'm going to turn it over to Bryan and VJ. And what I would like you to do is please put your questions in chat. We're going to have a conversation between these two. And then we will come back and we will answer some of those questions in a Q&A with Bryan and VJ. And before we get started here, I know that SolarWinds is top of mind for many, many people. We have the great privilege of having Bryan here, with his expertise, and Bryan's going to share a few comments about SolarWinds before we get started.
Thank you very much, Todd, and thank you to the members of the collaborative for putting this on. And thanks to each of you, near 900 or so, that took time out of your day for this. We're going to go through some topics at the high level and lots of great questions provided. But before we get into that, many of you, it was even more urgent to take time out from SolarWinds. So I'm not going to get into the more salacious side of it, but for those of you who are working it, we're there with you and helping a lot of people through it as well. And for those of you who aren't, the CISA is the best page for information without a lot of marketing or other things about what the indicators of compromise are, steps you can take to assess and quickly determine if you have a larger issue. And if you do, please contact whoever you have for incident response in terms of supporting that. So I would reference you first and foremost to that one. There's some great FireEye reports. There's some great other reports that the government has put together, all from that page. And I work for Aon Cyber Solutions, known as the component was known as Strauss-Friedberg to those of you in the legal community, or CISOs. And for the other board members, I'm going to hand it over to VJ for a couple of seconds about SolarWinds and kind of some of the pluses and minuses about board messaging around this to help avoid as many crises as we may have to deal with. Over to you for a minute, VJ.
Thank you, Bryan, and thanks to everyone for dialing in this afternoon. We really appreciate you taking the time. The past 48 hours has been pretty interesting, to say the least, as Bryan just covered the technical dimensions of incident response. What I've been doing is engaging with multiple board directors and debriefing multiple boards on the, number one, the depth of the problem, and number two is not to speculate. The key point here is not to speculate. The investigation is very early on, so it would be best course of action for CISOs at this point to simply look at the remediation and immediate response and not get into the salacious part, as Bryan just called out. So the third bullet point here is to clearly understand and not to have a reaction of shutting down all of SolarWinds. At the end of the day, SolarWinds is your monitoring platform. So you do need some form of a monitoring platform. Walk through your crisis management plan just as if this is a proper cyber incident, and navigate this as if this is an evolving investigation. Those are the three key takeaways I've been talking to most of the board members. And leave the conversation channel open, provide a bi-weekly update on the status of what's exactly going on. Back to you, Bryan.
Thank you, VJ. And so for those of you, the reason I need to correct, because many of you know NCIS is a TV show. That's where I founded the program. Quick bullet, we weren't that cute, we weren't that thin, and we can't solve crime in 28 minutes when you take all the commercials out. And VJ has been a CISO at HD Supply and many of the other companies, as I've been a CISO as well. Part of our job is to focus on the here and now, to mitigate things like SolarWinds in a very regimented way, and to help our board as much call attention to issues as call attention away from things that they can't do anything about. If you have it well in hand, brief them on your plan, brief them on your incident response, mitigate with locking down your access control lists or your IP whitelisting or other things that won't cripple the business. Because at a certain point, sometimes you have to take a tank into battle that ain't completely working right. And so these things happen. And we need to be the professionals above the strum and drang as CIOs, as general counsels. And when there is an incident, we'll deal with it. So what we're going to do is talk. We have about 20 minutes. We're going to talk about a couple of things. And I've gotten your questions about whether cyber insurance will cover SolarWinds. In any case, let me just get that out of the way, and then so you're not waiting 19 minutes for that. In any case, coverage in any situation is always kind of on a case by case, but many of you are worried about the force majeure clause or the act of war clause, which is a huge thing in property policies. Depending on who placed your policy and how's it placed, that may not be an issue for cyber, And if you are a target of terrorism and need extra, there are other policies for that. So without going down the rabbit hole of insurance, because I do now work for one of the world's largest brokers, we sit above the insurance companies at Aon. I am glad to go into depth or get more information if you have specific questions around that. But it is a great set of questions to ask. So VJ, I'm going to do like a 30-second or 60-second on the history of the insurance. I'm going to bring it back to you to talk about that kind of enterprise waterfront risk. So for those of you that are curious about why insurance is taking a role in the community, I'll do the quickest version of historic insurance I can. I swear it won't be that boring. Steam engines back in the 1800s were in the middle of cities, and they would bring a locomotive into a factory and just sit it there and run it to basically power Philadelphia in the 1890s. Every once in a while, the steam engines would blow up and kill a lot of people, unfortunately. So a company called Hartford Steam Boiler developed a piece of architecture, the Hartford Steam Loop, that made them not blow up. It was a pressure relief valve. And they said, if you want insurance around your locomotive parked in the middle of a city, you have to have this little piece of infrastructure. Fast forward to the middle of the century, car companies didn't invent seatbelts and airbags. Insurance companies did to protect the lives of people in those cars. Now, fast forward here, our cyber steam engines are driving into stuff and blowing up. Insurance companies are going to work to find reference architectures and to find statistically, not about who has the best salespeople, statistically, what technologies avoid ransomware, a breach, solar winds being a problem, and other things. These reference architectures will start to help CISOs, general counsels, and CIOs pick technologies that are battle proven and statistically battle proven. So VJ, you've been an expert in that overall waterfront. Let's talk about how that preparation helps get ready for the insurance preparation.
Yeah, that's a great backstory there, Brian. By the way, I live in Connecticut, so that's very near and dear to me. So that having spent about 25 plus years in enterprise technology, cybersecurity, 6 times CISO, presently a CXO is a better way to frame it. Then about 15 plus cybersecurity programs, so forth, and I've been working with Bryan as well. One of the key takeaway points is there is always a way to look at this at a strategic perspective. You can always approach the development of the cybersecurity program in a very big, I always look at it as a ship. You can always start building the ship in different blocks, or you can simply go ahead and say, let me just park the ship, let me just dock it, and then protect the ship from a different angle. Enterprise risk management, or ERM, is still a very developing field. The most common consensus you may hear about ERM is going to come from most likely some of the top 5 accounting firms developing a corporate risk management portfolio. Now, that's a good starting point. What we have been able to do in various engagements, and by the way, I had released about 3 different versions of supply chain security frameworks back in 2013 when I was at HD Supply. This was all about distribution and supply chain management. So to put this in simple perspective, the process of looking at your internal IT as a supply chain network, just the way you source your raw material, you send it to your appropriate factory floor, you produce it and you distribute it, and then you take care of the maintenance, your IT sort of works in a similar fashion. When you start looking at it from that perspective, each of your component in the cog has a couple of different characteristics. One is what you're servicing. Number 2, every service that you provide or every deliverable you have has an inherent risk. And the third dimension of the inherent risk is how do I manage, transfer, or mitigate the risk? So this is where, in a simplified diagram, each of this is a block level. So to put that in perspective really quick, you have your data center as an example. Your data center servers have different components to it. Each component has an inherent risk. You can choose to mitigate it or transfer the risk. And then when you take a step back and look at it as an overall operation between the data center, the application it's serving, and the consumption model, your overall plan roughly comes together. Now, when you look at cyber insurance, or why it's important to have a 360-degree view of this, and this is the framework that Bryan and I have been working for quite some time, and I have released this to the open market, Risk 360 is essentially the focus of how do I look at this entire environment and calculate in a binary numerical fashion where the risk scoring is. And why do you need this? You need this because when you go get your cyber insurance or technology coverage, you need to be able to articulate which component has the probability of going into a deeper risk position, and how do I navigate that in terms of a problem. Now, Brian, we have discussed this in a couple of other conversations. You may have a broader fabric of risk coverage. There is the silent coverage policy, then you have the policies pertaining to, as you started out, the terrorism, nation state. Now, what I have noticed is when it comes down to ransomware as a specific topic, some of all these seems to play out during a recovery exercise. What are your thoughts?
And thanks. And the next part of what we wanted to cover as we laid this out was we talked about the history and the basics of having frameworks. VJ's been a thought leader in the community for a while. There are, as there are a lot of insurance brokers, companies, and things like that, there are a lot of frameworks, but at least having a framework to start. One of the things, the questions that was posed is, what does it really mean to have insurance? And what I'll tell you as CISOs, you need to start with an enterprise risk view of which cyber is a component. Terms that you're going to learn a lot about: business interruption, kidnap and ransom, crime policy, property policy with silent cyber, and other mysterious things that I actually had to go get my certification in insurance as a broker just to understand how they talk to each other. It's a lot more complex, but one of the biggest concerns is, will cyber pay off? And that is the Maersk discussion. What everybody needs to understand, and again, I'm not going to go into the particulars of a case that's being adjudicated, that was not a cyber policy. That was a property policy and a legitimate direct act of war. So there's a great discussion happening over there, but that is different than the discussion you would have when placing and broking insurance. And as a small sidebar, if any of you want to know how interesting insurance is, figure out when your water heater breaks, whether it's covered or not, or whether there's water in your basement, you don't know where the water came from. You have to figure out causality and a bunch of stuff before you can. There are brokers. There's been a couple questions in the discussion about what does it really mean to have insurance. And VJ, you talked about that: protect, detect, restore, transfer, respond. Insurance is the thing that is a backstop. It is not something you rely on, because if you have fire insurance on your house and your house burns down, you still have to deal with the project, even if insurance involved, and you'll never be made whole by any insurance. I mean, God bless them, but
That's right.
No, it will still be more pain and suffering. It's best to avoid the fire and have good fire extinguishers and smoke detectors and/or sprinkler systems, which goes back to this enterprise risk. And insurance before, during, and after, and then I'm going to bring it back over to VJ to talk about this. Before, as VJ talked about, getting ready and articulating a framework program, being aligned, being regimented, having that overview. Now, we have a thing called a PsyQ, or cyber quotient, that does a very cursory framework look and gives you scores based on the NIST standard and a bunch of others, and also acts as an application for brokering cyber insurance. Here's a distinction. Brokers talk to all the insurance companies. If you call the insurance company direct, you're just buying from them. So there's a difference in the community. Aon, Lloyd's of London, and many other great companies do that. Just so I'm being fair play here in our knowledge exchange. So that before getting ready to talk about insurance makes you ask a bunch of questions. What trigger events in cyber may cause us to have a business interruption issue? And that's where CISOs, go hug your chief risk officer or buy your general counsel a cup of coffee and learn a little bit about insurance. And then you can talk about, what the coverages are, the triggers are, and that's what the brokers can help you with. So let's talk about that preparation, VJ. Over to you for what are some of the pluses and minuses of getting into that process?
It's a great thought process there, Brian, right? So, I recollect about 15 years ago when I first started thinking through this for an organization I was a CISO for. My fundamental understanding was to sit down, as you just said, with the risk officer, the risk manager of the company. And at that time, Most cyber insurance policies was a manuscript. It was a manual edition. It was written as a separate writer. But here is the quick and simple takeaway. Your cyber insurance primarily covers 4 key areas, right? Number 1, it covers your network security and privacy. Second is your network business interruption. Third is your media liability, right? And then the last one is your errors and omissions. So most cyber insurance policies would be covered within these 4 key pillars, or should cover these 4 pillars. And the way you want to look at this is 3 different blocks, as Bryan and I have been talking about. Before an incident occurs, you want to be able to qualify using a framework. And once again, reach out to either Bryan or me to talk about what the Risk 360 or the Quotient program is. That'll help you identify the pre-definition phase of how to address the 4 pillars. Now, once you have those 4 key takeaways, you can start actually preparing for 3 important things. 1 is your crisis response plan or your incident response plan. Number 2, your tabletop exercise in collaboration with your carrier and carrier counsel, or however you choose your counsel. And number 3, you also want to engage a retainer from a perspective of an incident response. In this case, I have engaged Bryan in a couple of different scenarios, and he's been very resourceful. So pick these 3 categories.
So VJ, if I could jump in, could you repeat the 4 pillars? Some of our audience members are asking for that in the chat, please.
You bet. It's network security and privacy. That's your first pillar. Second is your network business interruption. This could also be your technology business interruptions, including your data center interruptions. Gmail loses out, had an outage, things of that scenario, right? Third pillar is your media liability. Fourth is your errors and omissions. So tracking this back here, for you to qualify what's in each one of these buckets. For example, if I look at network security, a couple of things it could be covered, right? Your legal expenses, your forensic expenses, in negotiation of your ransomware demand, your data restoration, public relation expertise, credit monitoring. So these are examples of what's covered under the top tier in the first pillar. So we have various categories, but here's the most important point. Having done this a handful of times, no 2 organizations are the same. The reason why we do Risk 360 analysis is to clearly understand how your business model works and what are the inherent risks within your business model, and how do you translate those risks into the pre-qualification bucket. So let's assume that now that you have this bill of materials paperwork, that's your first stage. Your second stage is during the incident. And for that, I want to turn it to Bryan.
Thanks, VJ. And so what does insurance do during an incident? And that's one of the components to talk about, is having your team picked before game day, or knowing who your fire department is when you need to call, is a critical component of this discussion. And that's one of the things about $0 retainers and the like that absolutely, reach out, we can talk about it, but I'll talk about what they are. They're an MSA that gets the terms and conditions of the fire department out of the way so they can show up. Now, you still have to let a statement of work for each incident that can be covered under privilege. So some of the things that a lot of CISOs may not realize in the earlier parts of their career at smaller organizations, many times a breach is going to be run by outside counsel, your lawyer's lawyer. And they will engage under a 3-party contract between you, the outside, your organization, the outside counsel, and somebody like us at Strauss Freeburg, now Aon, to come and be that response team, the cyber smoke jumpers, as I call myself and the forensic team. We will engage and come on site under the direction and privilege of counsel most of the time. Now, other times for internal investigations and other things may also be under privilege, or for pen testing and things like that, it may be direct. But it's important, just like with insurance, to have those discussions about a $0 retainer before you need one, because then you're running a document through legal, which is wasting those first 4, 6, 12 hours. And that's one of the things about, and the insurance and the provider needs to be on the insurance panels. You can't have your cousin fix your car and then claim it to USAA. It doesn't work that way. And therefore, it's one of the issues that you need to be able to understand and have in place before there's an incident. And also the preparation for that discussion, the discussion with your fire department. You can even potentially, we do small things for clients where we take a walkthrough and look at smoke detectors and things. It's very cursory engagement. But those types of things before, to understand who you're calling, how they're going to log in, how are you going to provision smoke jumper accounts, maybe having those permissions and things in advance, but not turned on so they're not a surface area. And VJ, having been through, luckily not at your primary organizations in your career, but some of your secondary ones, what are you thinking in the first couple minutes when you realize something is bubbled up above where the SOC's going to handle it? You have to wake up a CFO and a general counsel. What's that like for you as a CISO?
I will walk you through this story. This happened not too long ago, a couple of months ago. My SOC team basically escalates a couple of different alerts. Immediately, I recognize this is a Ryuk variant making its way through an organization. The first things first is who you call first depends upon, first off, your organizational crisis plan, number one. Number two, which industry sector you're part of. Financial industry sector, a CPG company, or your healthcare, they all have different priorities based on regulatory requirements. But the first order of business is you have what's called as a breach response team. That's your internal breach response team. The first call goes to the internal breach response team. The second call immediately goes to the carrier in order to get them engaged. And in the same way, it also goes to your retainer, whoever has the counsel / the retainer. And then based upon, once again, which industry segment you are, the FBIs of the world can get involved based on the right level of engagement. Now, as Bryan clearly pointed out, all of this is done in attorney-client privilege. This is all done on the advisory of the counsel. So your first call has always got to start with your breach response team, which typically has your CISO, CIO, your legal counsel, and of course, the person who's going to support you. That's typically worked for me, Bryan. Are there any variations during your practice?
Yes, and we're approaching half past, so we have about 5 minutes during the major session, and then we're going to move to Q&A. So the other thing you have to do, make sure if you haven't picked that team before game day, is you call your priest, your lawyer, and your insurance agent in terms of handling a breach. So the issue is make sure that that team is approved, because again, you're looking to make sure that those capabilities are going to have the best chance of maximizing coverage. One of the questions that's come up repeatedly in some of you who registered, and also from people on here, is about small businesses. There are options for small businesses. Aon has a thing with CoverWallet. Again, I'm not going to go into details, but there are options for you if you are an army of one or a SEAL team of two, and those things. Also, for those of you who are doing a self-insured, i.e. having no insurance, or a captive, actually having a legit insurance setup, there are tons of options for that. Again, this is where the CISOs need to sit down with the risk registry, to use another term, of that framework of all the enterprise risks: terrorism, fire, flood, general unrest, things like that. And cyber's one of them, to have that holistic 360 discussion. For you CISOs, it elevates you to be talking to the board about non-technical but risk-centric components of your job. It is important for us as CISOs to speak not at this general counsel or at the CEO, to talk with them on their own terms. We have to level it up, not dumb it down. And so as we look at the role of having those discussions about the overall risks to the business, structuring it in things like VJ's worked on and the insurance companies are working on in terms of assessing, it is that very component that allows you to then have a more graduated program to identify things that should be pulled forward that are common issues. And then one other issue, and I'm going to hand it to you, VJ, for 2 or 3 minutes, then we're going to move to Q&A, is there's a lot of questions right now about ransomware and the fact that OFAC put out guidance about payments and so forth. Yes, that guidance is a refresh. This is not legal advice. I am not a lawyer. I'm not your lawyer. So these are the things that having an executive tabletop or other things I've been running for clients over this year, specifically around that issue. And in a recent one, the CEO of one of the cancer research institutes that led the cure for COVID discussions. We had one of these tabletops and he turns to his team and goes, I will not pay terrorists. Make sure we are not in that position. And then he said the most important thing, and tell me what I need to do or fund to help you avoid that as much as possible, but I understand the reality of the risk. That healthy discussion about pulling forward priorities and funding from a CEO to his senior staff was great to see. VJ, a couple thoughts and then we'll go to Q&A.
You got it. Yeah, I've seen a lot of very exciting questions here on this topic. So let's try to cover as much as possible. I'll try to weave in as I go through this. Number one, there is a request for repeating the core pillars. And once again, let's quickly wrap that up. It's network security and privacy, network business interruption, media liability, errors and omission. Second point I want to really call out about the risk register. I'll weave this question in here. Insurance carriers are progressively developing. If you look at the cyber insurance market and how carriers are assessing the insured, that is how well your organization is doing, that model is constantly evolving. A lot of insurance carriers from Aon to Chubb to everybody in the mix, they have their own assessment program, usually partnering with cybersecurity experts, industry veterans like me. And what we actually do is help the organization prepare and structure their risk register in a consumable manner. In other words, we help you build the ERM, Enterprise Risk Management Framework, that is unique to your organization. And when you're ready with the document, then the carriers can engage quite effectively with that for better coverage. Second, risk register, really quick here, Brian. We have been speaking about this. Risk register has probably been the most clean, articulate way of representing the true sense of your problem within an organization, your risk score. How many of you have heard the question from the board director? Are we really secured? Can you guarantee that we won't have a breach? Obviously, the answer is no to that. But the question is, how do you articulate a response that is both strategic and tactical at the same time? So you bring up your risk register, you look at the trend analysis of the risk register. Is it going down over a period of time? Is it increasing? Let me give a quick call out before I turn it over to Brian here. What the pandemic has done, there's a lot of remote work. A lot of organizations are surprised, especially if an employee is connecting from their home network and an incident comes out of their home network. That likely is not covered. You need to go relook at what exactly is covered in terms of which network. A corporate network is different from your home network. So these are the things that you would capture in a risk analysis. So when the pandemic unfolded, Bryan and I were doing this for an organization. The thought process was, what are the new risk items in the register? And we identified this as a particular point. We went to the carrier to discuss further to say, are these covered? If an employee, even though connecting from VPN, has a compromised home network, what is considered the source of attack? That's a lot of food for thinking there. With that, Brian, I'll turn it over to you.
So great insights.
Over to
guys.
Todd.
I just have, I think you could go on for the rest of the day. I think, some of the comments in the chat, it's like drinking from a fire hose, and this will be available afterwards. We do post this on the Cybersecurity Collaborative YouTube channel, so this will be available and accessible afterwards. We do have some questions.